It was obvious when they entered my office that they had problems and were in trouble. It's not that I'm so sensitive and astute and aware of people's feelings. It's that people don't come to see me unless they are in trouble or have a problem. The paint showing the name on the frosted glass of the door was somewhat faded and peeling. It read, Matthew Steele, Investigations, Security Specialist. That's me, Matthew Steele, St. Louis, Missouri investigator and security consultant. I'm what's commonly known as a private detective. I also work as a security consultant at times, better known as a bodyguard. I'll do almost anything pertaining to investigations, from background checks, to keeping the scum of society off your back and away from your body, to following a suspected cheating spouse, to finding runaways. Doesn't matter if it's a wife, a husband, a kid, or your enemy. I'll find them, for a price. I'll do just about anything that's legal, although that can be a fuzzy line sometimes. One thing I won't do is provide muscle to physically assault someone. If you and your neighbor or business associate are at an impasse over something, I won't kick their bum for you. I'll find out things from their past, if there is anything that you can use to control them, but if it's physical payback you want, then go talk to someone else. It was just before lunchtime, and I'd been sitting back in my chair with my feet on the desk, contemplating the world situation when the man and woman came in. Actually, I'd almost been asleep. Taking my feet off the desk and putting them back on the floor, I sat up and waited for one of them to speak. Mr. Steele? The man asked. I nodded, and he continued, I'm Jason Worth. This is my wife, Susan, and I need your help. He sat down without being asked and without waiting for his wife. Jason Worth was about 55 or so. His styled, thinning hair, smooth features, the spray-on suntan, and his very expensive clothes should have taken years off his appearance, but didn't. He was 6'1", muscular build, probably from a gym, and had an air of entitlement. Worth had an attitude that only a lot of money could bring, and it surrounded him like a shroud. I immediately took a dislike to him. Susan Worth is the kind of woman that shouldn't be allowed to walk down a busy street. Her looks would cause men to walk into signposts or wreck their cars because they'd be watching her instead of where they were going or what they were doing. Mrs. Worth couldn't have been more than 35, if I was being cruel, about the same age as me. Tall for a woman at 5'10", she had the type of body and face that could start wars. Hey, it happened back in Troy, it could happen now. Susan would have made Helen of Troy look like an ugly cousin. She also had a muscular build, but she looked like she did tennis or golf or something instead of hitting the gym exclusively. Susan leaned more toward a toned body than runway models. She had a sexy, girl-next-door face, sort of like Kate Hudson, long auburn hair worn loose down her back and piercing blue eyes. If she would walk across a bar or restaurant, men, and some women, would follow her with their eyes and thoughts. I watched as she sat down and crossed her legs. I sighed and settled back in my chair. Keep your mind on business, I told myself. Myself answered back saying, are you kidding me? Continuing the discussion with myself. The devil side of me said we would fit well together, as I'm 6'3". The devil also said that my hard muscled body, weighing 200 pounds even, would feel good against her. The last thing the devil said before I pushed him out of my mind was that my black hair and gray eyes were just the things she needed to compliment her. Get thee behind me, Satan. I've checked into your background a little, and I think you're just the man I need, Worth said. I nodded sagely and thought, yes, my background. Matthew Steele had been a rising star in the St. Louis Police's detective division at one time. I was sure to make captain by the time I was 35. That was 5 years ago. A sad set of circumstances led to my, shall we say, downfall, or should we say being screwed by the system. My partner and I were on a stakeout, and something I ate didn't agree with me. When you're on a stakeout, you can't be too choosy about food. I should have been more careful. After almost 2 hours of jumping out of the car, running into the nearby alley and throwing up, my partner suggested I go home. Hell, with you jumping in and out of the car, we might as well put up a neon sign saying, police stakeout on duty, so go home. I walked to the corner about 200 feet away, called the precinct and asked for a patrol car to pick me up and take me home. The two patrolmen good-naturedly ragged on me all the way to my house. Thinking back on what happened, it's a good thing they were with me. It's an old story and a cliche, but when I got home there was a strange car in the driveway. I entered my house with the two patrolmen behind me. The noises coming from down the hallway to the bedroom couldn't be mistaken. Somebody or bodies were getting it on. I walked to the bedroom door, knowing what I'd see before I got there. I was right. My wife Johanna and a man were having, I guess a conjugal visit is as good a way to describe it as any. What the hell? That was my not very original question. The same one that's been asked thousands of times. Having seen my share of domestic disputes, I planned on telling the guy to get the hell out of my house. In spite of my anger, I knew if I started beating on the guy, I might not stop, and that would lead me into trouble I didn't need. I already had a plate full. That was before I recognized my wife's playmate. Her boy toy was my superior at the department, Captain Joe Harper. Harper was a brown-nosing, but kissing hack that only got his position because of political pull. When I saw him stand up, naked, in surprise, I lost it. Still, I wouldn't have attacked him if he hadn't gone for his gun lying on the nightstand next to the bed. Guess he was as surprised as me, and his first thought was about self-preservation. I closed the distance between us before he could grab his weapon and hit him so hard I bet his daddy got a headache. He fell across the bed. I straddled him and started beating on him. Now I swear I hadn't planned on hitting my wife. I don't hit women, but she jumped between Harper and me. I never knew if she wanted to protect Harper or to stop me from going to jail. Johanna caught a roundhouse right hand and went ass over tea kettle off the bed. It's a good thing that the patrolman, who had brought me home, rushed down the hall to the bedroom when they heard me yell. If they hadn't, I might have killed that piece of crap Harper. They pulled me off him before I became guilty of manslaughter or murder. No one, including my wife, who worked for the local school board, and especially Captain Harper, wanted the situation to go public. He didn't bring charges of assault with intent and convinced Johanna not to press a spousal abuse complaint. However, when the dust cleared, I had lost my job and my wife. I did get to keep the house and most of the money. I complained that it wasn't right or fair that I would lose my job and Harper would go unpunished. It didn't do any good. I was still terminated for conduct unbecoming or some such bullshit. Harper didn't get off scot-free. A severe letter of reprimand was put in his file. Whoop-de-doo, I thought. Major Taylor, the head of the detective bureau, told me that Harper would be demoted to lieutenant, and because of that letter and the reason for it, would never get another promotion. Taylor also said Harper would have a hard time with the rank and file of the department. Yeah, but the a-hole still has a job, I argued. Where is his punishment? What has he lost? I've lost my wife and my job. Hell, I've lost my way of life. It's a bad result, Taylor said, but his family has too much political clout for the higher-ups in the department to do much more. If you need a hand or I can help, call me Matt. What about my background? I asked Worth. I was still a tad defensive about that piece of history. I know you were a good, maybe even great, police detective. I also know why you left the department. Worth took a gold cigarette case out of the inside pocket of his very expensive sports coat. Mind if I smoke? He asked and lit his cigarette before I answered either way. I slid the ashtray I keep for clients across the desk toward him. I don't smoke, but it isn't up to me to police people's vices or health. Your knowledge and talents as a detective plus your experience with your ex-wife suit you perfectly for this job. When he mentioned my ex, I thought, I was right. I don't like this son of a bitch. What's the job, Mr. Worth? My wife, Worth squirmed in his chair, obviously embarrassed and angry, had an affair with one of the hired help. It wasn't like that, Jason, Susan complained, but she had a sly little smile on her face. Shut up, Worth said in anger. It was like that. You just couldn't keep your hands off him, could you? I still can't believe it. A woman of your station and class running like a pig with a damned pool boy. Stanley is more than a pool boy. He's a very talented up-and-coming actor, Susan countered. Talented actor, my butt, Mr. Worth responded. He's had a few bit parts in plays at the Muni Opera, and it doesn't matter if he is an actor. You shouldn't have been with him. I didn't say his talent was in acting, now did I? Susan said with an evil smile. Damn you, Susan. When this is over, you and I will have to revisit our relationship, Mr. Worth promised. Susan started to answer, but I interrupted. Enough. I'm not interested in hearing you two verbally tear each other up. What's the job, Mr. Worth? Like I said, Susan had an affair with our pool boy. Worth stared at his wife, daring her to deny it. When I found out, I threw him off the property and put the word out so no one that matters would hire him. Again, what do you want me to do, Mr. Worth? Well, apparently the boy didn't like the consequences of his little tryst with my wife, and he has threatened me. What Jason really means is that Stanley is blackmailing him, Susan said with a sexy little grin. At least it looked sexy to me. He, Stanley I mean, told my husband that he had a DVD of Stanley and me together. Said he'd make sure it went public and all our friends, family, and Jason's business associates would get a copy if Jason didn't pay him $100,000. Shut up, Susan, Worth almost yelled. Looking back at me, he said, I want you to find him and persuade him to leave me alone and to give you the DVD and any copies he has made. Do anything that's necessary to make him leave us alone. Worth looked at me with an angry face and added, anything that works, anything at all. Have you contacted the police? Blackmail is a crime, you know. If I go to the police, I might as well put an ad in the paper saying my wife acted like a 304, Worth angrily replied, glaring at Susan. That's why I came to you. I've heard that you are very discreet. From who? I asked. What? Who referred you to me? Well, Major Taylor for one. We've met him at several of the police social functions. Worth took a deep breath. I don't understand the question, Mr. Steele. What difference does it make how we found you? The only question is, are you going to take the job? I haven't made a decision just yet, I replied. Leave your number and I'll call you by tomorrow morning with my answer. There are other private investigators, you know? Yes, there are, Mr. Worth. Feel free to contact any of them, but if you want me, you'll have to wait until tomorrow morning to see if I'm available. Worth looked around my office. He saw the worn carpet, the walls that needed painting, and the beat-up desk I was sitting behind. It doesn't look like you can afford to be choosy about jobs. Appearances are deceiving, Mr. Worth, and besides, money isn't everything. I lied. Money was everything. Well, almost everything. If you like, I'll call you tomorrow. If not, it's been nice meeting you. Very well, Worth said and stood. I'll expect your call tomorrow, Mr. Steele. Come along, Susan. Mrs. Worth made a show of uncrossing her long legs, stood, and offered her hand. I think I'm going to like working with you, Mr. Steele. I'll bet you'll be more fun than poor old Stanley. Not for the same reasons, I hope, Mrs. Worth. Goodbye. I called Major Taylor right after the Worths left. Hey, Major. I understand you're sending business my way. I take it you're talking about Jason Worth, Matt. Why'd you suggest he contact me with his problem? I don't know what his problem is, the Major said. He was a bit secretive about it. When he asked if I knew any PIs I could recommend, I told him I'd recommend you or Raleigh Chambers. He's a spoiled rich guy, and I thought you might make a piece of change off him. Thanks, Major. I can't talk about his problem, but I'm going to take the job. How are you doing, Matt? I'm good, Major. It's been almost 2 years since I was screwed by the department, and I've made lemonade out of those lemons. I like my life. I can work when I want and for who I want. And I don't have some politically connected shit telling me what to do. How are you doing for money? I've heard about that office of yours and the truck you're driving. Between you and me, Major, the work I'm getting is setting me up pretty well. The truck runs good, and I don't worry about parking it in some of the areas I've had to go to. As for the office, the only reason I even have one is for someplace to meet clients. Wouldn't a nicer office impress your clients more? My place makes the people think I'm a little desperate. It makes them think I'll work harder to earn their money. Okay, Matt. Call me if I can help. Sure, Major, and thanks. What wasn't mentioned by Major Taylor or myself was the settlement I got from the St. Louis Police Department. I'd sued for wrongful termination and a whole bunch of other things. My attorney, Jeb Smith, was an old college buddy, and he is very good. Real vicious great white shark in an ocean of lesser sharks. Jeb was so good that the other sharks got out of the water when Jeb started swimming. It's good to have friends. It's even better to have friends that can get you go-to-hell type money in a settlement. Go-to-hell type money is when you have enough money to tell everyone to go to hell. You don't need them for your livelihood. You really don't have a case, Matt, Jeb told me. But he had this shark's grin on. I mean, you did beat the hell out of your boss. And that's insubordination, no matter what the reason. But what? I asked. But the department doesn't want the publicity of this case. It's bad enough that a superior humps a subordinate's wife. But when the superior gets off with a slap on the wrist and the husband gets fired, well, that won't sit well with the public and really wouldn't sit well with the rank-and-file policemen. They'll settle, and for high 6 figures. Jeb grinned and added, and I'll get them to pay my fees too. Then he laughed like hell. Jeb didn't care much for the establishment. Jeb sent an intent to file suit letter to the police commissioner with copies to Captain Harper, his boss, and their legal department. Then he sat back and waited for the explosion. It wasn't long in coming. The attorney for the police, Judas Dobson, immediately called to set up a meeting with Jeb and me. When Jeb told me about the meeting, the when and where, I said, Judas, that's a fitting name for an attorney. Then realizing who I was talking to said, sorry, Jeb, I don't mean you. Jeb laughed and opened us another beer. Call me what you want, but pay me my 30 pieces of silver. He read through the request for a meeting again. We'll go meet with Dobson, but here's what I want you to do. We walked into Dobson's office and were shown to a large conference room. The secretary got us coffee and Dobson and 3 other people came into the room. They were all lawyers. Jeb was outnumbered 4-1, but I had confidence in my shark. Mr. Steele, I'm Judas Dobson, he said as he sat down across the table. It was all I could do not to laugh at hearing his name. I will speak for the St. Louis Police Department during these negotiations. Hold on, Dobson, I said. This is not a negotiation meeting. If my demands aren't met, and met by end of business tomorrow, I'll file suit. All of this was according to the script Jeb and I had worked out the previous night. Surely Mr. Smith has told you that you have no case? Dobson's face was red. The young, pretty female lawyer on his side of the table was trying to keep from smiling. Yeah, he did. But I'll demand a jury trial and take my chances in court. I looked directly at Dobson with a challenge. Worst case scenario is I have to pay Jeb's fees. Best case, the jury will see what a hosing I got and side with me. They'll roast Harper, the department, and the city of St. Louis. Your choice, Dobson. Come on, Jeb, let's get lunch so you can pad your expense account. I stood and started toward the door. Jeb stood, shrugged his shoulders at Dobson, and followed me. We had a hard time eating lunch because we kept laughing about the look on Dobson's face. Jeb called me about 1 p.m. the next day. We'll have a check first thing tomorrow morning, Matt. If you take care, you probably won't have to work for 3 or 4 years. Enough reminiscing, I thought. I picked up the phone and called Mr. Worth. I've decided to at least talk more in depth about your case, Mr. Worth. I'll be out to your place tomorrow morning at 10 to get more information and possibly a retainer. Is that really necessary, Mr. Steele? It is if you want me to work on your case. Your choice. I'll see you at 10 sharp. Worth hung up the phone with a little extra force. Worth's house was set back from the 2-lane blacktop road. You couldn't see it from the street. The grounds were more like a golf course with lots of trees, rather than just a place for a house. The grass was extensive with no bare spots and manicured to an exact height. The address was so exclusive that it didn't have a city or community name. It just said, Street Point, Lewis County, and a zip code. The look I got from Worth that morning as I drove up the tree-lined road to his house was priceless. I was driving my old pickup truck. The right rear wheel fender was a study in body-filling Bondo. I was having the rusted area repaired. My truck has 3 different colors of paint, not counting the Bondo, because one door and one front fender are each from different trucks. In its defense, the old Chevy has a 350 cu, an engine that's just 1 or 2 accessories from being a full-blown racing engine. Not only does it run good, it will outrun most cars, including police interceptors. My truck is what is known as a sleeper. The old adage of you can't tell a book by its cover aptly applies to me and my truck. Worth had a disgusted look and a frown on his face when I pulled to a stop in front of his house. Really, Mr. Steele? Is it necessary to drive to my residence in such a deplorable, dilapidated vehicle? Yep, that's my work vehicle. My only work vehicle. I had to shut the driver's door twice to get it to latch. Shall we get down to business, Mr. Worth? Or do you want to discuss my ride some more? I smiled at him and waited. He looked at my red satin, St. Louis Cardinal jacket, the St. Louis Rams t-shirt, faded jeans, and cowboy boots with the same disgust on his face. Worth was wearing a dark blue suit and vest with a lighter color pinstripe plus a blue-on-blue shirt with little diamond shapes on it, opened at the neck. I think the shirt was a Christian Dior. His clothes were his clothes were worth more than my truck. Come inside, please, Worth said, and turned to lead the way into his humble abode. The house was a copy of one of the southern plantation homes that you see in the movies. Tall white columns supported a second-story balcony. I guess he likes to stand out there and watch the peasants work, I thought. Inside, facing the entryway, was a staircase that would rival the one at Terra in Gone with the Wind. It was about 8 feet wide and led to a landing. From there it split, so there were 2 ways to continue to the second story. Jacqueline, bring coffee into the sitting room, please, Worth requested of a young woman in a gray and white uniform. To me, the room he led us into would be a living room. I guess the elite and landed gentry called it a sitting room. The sitting room was very large and very airy with floor-to-ceiling windows along one wall. The view was over the manicured lawn and swimming pool at the rear of the house. The furniture was mostly wrought tan with glass top tables. This is a damn jungle, I thought as I saw all the plants scattered around the room. Guess they want the feeling of being outside without having to deal with the heat or insects. Susan Worth stood as we entered. This time she was dressed a little more demurely, but there was no doubt that she was a very sexy lady. I'm quick that way. I'm a trained detective and I pick up on things like that in a hurry. She shook my hand and held it a little longer than necessary, both to her husband's and my discomfort. Got to watch myself around this one, I thought. You don't screw around with a client's wife or girlfriend. It makes them hesitant about paying the bill. Pulling my hand away from her, I looked around the room. On one wall, over a wood-burning fireplace, was an oil portrait of Susan Worth. Now, I don't know much about art. I just know what I like, and I really like this painting. Susan was sitting on a plain chair with no arms. Her legs were crossed and her arms were folded across in front of her, holding her opposite shoulders, and she wore a beautiful smile. And that's all. Mr. Worth walked over to me as I stared at the portrait. "She screwed the artist too," he said with more than a little disgust and anger in his voice. "And then the bastard still demanded full payment. She seems to like tormenting me by screwing the help." I turned to look at Susan, and she gave me a sexy little smile as if to say, "You too can be one of the lucky ones." Yeah, I'm definitely going to have to watch myself around this one. My thought echoed again. "Okay, Mr. Worth, tell me more about this Stanley." "His name is Stanley Moore. Here's a picture of him," he said, handing it to me. It showed a young man about 25 with a lot of sandy blonde hair, blue eyes, and a well-muscled showing a six-pack. That picture was taken by a security company that watches the house when we're away for any length of time, Worth informed me. "Okay, I'll need all the information you can give me about good old Stanley, like his address, phone number, and such. I've put together this, biography on Moore." Worth handed me a folder that contained Stanley's last known address and phone number. It also told me where he went to college, didn't graduate, and what he was interested in. Besides Susan Worth, that is. I looked at Worth with an unspoken question. "The parts about his likes and such came off his employment application," he said. Turning to his wife, he suggested, "I'm sure Susan knows more about him than I." Susan gave me one of her semi-smiles. "I really don't know that much about Stan." Looking at her husband, she added, "We never talked that much. How did Moore contact you about the money?" I asked. Worth went to his desk, unlocked the middle drawer, and searched for something. While he was doing that, I looked at Susan. She's so sexy it ought to be against the law, I thought. Still, I wonder why Worth puts up with her crap. For that matter, it's obvious she doesn't think much of her husband, so I'm wondering why she stays. Silly me. It's the money, stupid. Shaking my head, I had answered my own dumb question. "I received this by courier at my office," Worth said, and handed me a folded sheet of paper. It was a letter, really a note, supposedly sent by Stanley Moore. The note said that he had a 2-hour DVD showing Susan and Stanley getting it on. He wanted $100,000 for the DVD, or he would send it to friends, family, and business associates of the Worths. The note said he would call them in a few days to set up a drop for the money. When he got the money, he'd send Worth the DVD. The note was a Word document from a computer. Even the signature was printed. "I know this is a silly question, but do you have those kinds of funds available, Mr. Worth?" Jason Worth looked at me like I was an idiot, like I was asking if I'd asked if the Pope was Catholic. "Oh, Jason has that and much more," Susan answered with a grin. "Don't you, dear?" "Let's keep our business, Susan," Worth chastised her. The look on his face was interesting. He showed both pride that he had that kind of money and frustration that his wife would talk about it. "Yes, Mr. Steele, I have the funds. It will take a trip to my bank to get the cash, but it's available." "How many employees do you have, Mr. Worth?" I asked. "What difference does that make?" "Stanley Moore is the one demanding money. This note is printed from a computer or word processor. It isn't actually signed by a person. Anyone could have used Stanley's name. So, how many employees do you have that are here all the time?" "Why only those that live here?" "Only someone that was here all the time would be in a position to record Mrs. Worth and Stanley. A stranger would have been seen coming in to set the camera or to take out the recording. Unless there is someone who comes here a lot, it has to be someone that the staff wouldn't find unusual being here." "There are 4 that live here." Worth stopped and then continued when I raised an eyebrow. Raising an eyebrow is a very good way of communicating without speaking, if you can do it. The raised eyebrow can ask a question, show disbelief, interest in what someone is telling you, or invite them to continue. I've practiced in front of a mirror until I mastered the trick. "Samuel is the butler and house manager. His wife Millie is the cook and housekeeper," Worth informed me. "Ralph is the chauffeur. He also maintains the vehicles. And Jacqueline assists Millie with the house." After a few seconds, he continued. "Of course, there's Susan's string of playmates. The latest one is Danby Summers. He's here at least 2 times a week from what I hear from the staff. He comes during the day mostly, when I'm at the office." Susan at first looked surprised that Jason knew that her boy toy visited, and then she got a wicked smile on her face. "If you spent more time with me, he wouldn't be able to visit, now would he, Jason?" "If I spent more time with you instead of at the office, you'd have to get a job to keep up the lifestyle you've become accustomed to, Susan," Worth replied. Jason Worth looks like he's caught between a rock and a hard place, I thought. If he doesn't make a lot of money, Susan won't stay with him. But him spending a lot of time away gives her the chance to have other men. Rock in a hard place, all right. You need to get me pictures and information about each of your employees. I'll be spending some time here at your home, checking things out, and I'll have some questions for them. You can tell them I'm a security consultant. I take it you've decided to accept my case, in spite of your reservations about our lifestyle, Worth said with what I took as a relief. Yes, sir. It isn't up to me to make a judgment about how you live. It wouldn't work for me, but hey, whatever floats your boat. My concern is stopping Stanley Moore or whoever is trying to extort money from you. What about this Danby Summers character? Where would I find him? We're having a little get-together tonight, Susan answered. Just a few people, 20 or so. Danby will be here. Won't you join us? I looked at Worth. He didn't seem too happy at the scenario. I don't know if it's because Danby is coming to his house, or that I'd be coming in a social context, I thought. Probably a little of both. All right, Mrs. Worth. I'll be here at 7. Will you be staying overnight, Mr. Steele? Mrs. Worth asked. That could be ever so interesting. The look in her eyes and the tone of her voice was predatory. I doubt it, I answered. I'll make sure not to unless it's absolutely necessary, I thought. I don't mess around with married women, but Susan Worth could tempt the bronze statue of St. Louis in front of the art museum. You realize that proper attire will be necessary, Mr. Steele, Worth said with a bit of haunting glare. I think I have a clean pair of jeans and t-shirt, Mr. Worth. The look on his face was priceless. I'll clean up my act, sir, I promise. Do you carry a gun, Mr. Steele? I nodded and he asked, May I see it? Reaching under my jacket to the small of my back, I pulled out my Glock 21C and showed it to Worth. I traded in my 9mm Beretta 92 FS after talking to another former St. Louis police detective, Raleigh Chambers. He had a couple of shootouts with his 9 and changed to the .45 Glock on the advice of Jacob Tully, a retired Marine gunnery sergeant and another former cop. Raleigh and I worked a couple of cases together while still with the department and had become friends. Tully had been instrumental in my changing to the Glock also. I just made detective first and was full of myself. With my gold shield in hand, I decided I wanted to carry a .44 Magnum, like Dirty Harry. I bought a Smith & Wesson 629 with a 6.5-inch barrel and took it to the department shooting range. The first time I fired it, the recoil threw the pistol back into my face. It cut me over my right eye, and I had to have 3 stitches. Tully was the manager and head instructor at the range, and laughed so hard he had to sit down. That was the end of my .44 Magnum, Dirty Harry, experience. Worth reached for my gun, but I pulled it away from him. Nobody touches my weapon, I said. My, that's a big one, Susan said and looked directly at me. Are you any good with it? And are you sure you won't let me touch it? With the smile on her face and the look in her eye, I wasn't sure that it was the gun she was talking about. I'm sure, Mrs. Worth. I wouldn't want you to get hold of more than you can handle, I replied. That took some wind out of her sails from the look on her face. Besides, I wouldn't touch you sexually if I was a monk who years ago had made his vow of chastity, but now was trying to make up for lost time. Mrs. Worth was incensed that I would not be swayed by her charms, and for me speaking the way that I did to her. You're a cold man, Mr. Steele, she said with more than a little anger. Yep, that's me, I replied. Cold as steel, Steele. Susan, behave yourself, Worth ordered. Then to me, can you and will you use your gun when you find more? I'll find more, get the DVD, and he won't bother you again. I can hit what I aim at and will shoot if necessary. But let's get something straight, Mr. Worth. I'm not an assassin and I don't hire out to kill people. If that's what you want, you've got the wrong man. No, I understand. He paused for several seconds. What is your fee, Mr. Steele? I'm sorry to leave, Mrs. Worth said. But I have a tennis lesson and Sam gets upset if I'm late. She crossed to Mr. Worth and kissed him. I should be home at the usual time, dear, unless Sam keeps me over. Turning to me, she said, Goodbye, Mr. Steele. Mr. Worth didn't try to hide his smile at Susan's anger and actually laughed as she hurried out of the room. Sam, I asked after she had left the room. Another man for her to fool around with, I thought. Samantha Dooley, her tennis instructor. If it was a man, I'd have to watch him too. Mr. Worth shook his head and sighed. What is your fee, Mr. Steele? $300 a day plus expenses. Mr. Worth and I need a 5-day retainer. Normally I charge $100 a day plus expenses, but Jason Worth was exceeding rich and I just didn't like him, so I upped my rates. Isn't that a little high? Not if you want your problem solved, I replied. All right, Worth said. Went to a desk and wrote me a check. Mr. Worth, as I said, it isn't up to me to approve of your lifestyle, and you can tell me to mind my own business, but why do you let your wife get away with her crap? At first, Worth puffed up in anger at my question, but then he seemed to deflate like a balloon with a hole in it. Shaking his head, he answered, You've seen her. I know she married me for the money, and until recently I could live with that. I mean, having her on my arm when we go out is very satisfying. Guess it's like showing off. See what I've got, and don't you wish you did? He reached behind him to a built-in bar, took a cut glass decanter, and poured a dark glass of liquor. Worth held the decanter toward me in invitation. It's Gentleman Jack, if you'd care for a taste. I nodded, and he poured a second drink. The problem is that I've come to, well, if not love her, at least I've become tremendously fond of her. That's the main reason I've tolerated her behavior. Worth took a drink and stood taller. But now that her flirting, sexy come-ons, and suggestive behavior have become a reality, my tolerance is quickly coming to an end. I took a healthy drink of the whiskey and looked directly into his eyes. Mr. Worth, if nothing else, you don't have to worry about me around Susan. He stared at me for several seconds, and a small smile came over his face. Worth handed me the check. Thank you, Mr. Steele, both for taking my case and for your promise. How do we proceed from here? I'll come to your little get-together tonight, so I can check out Summers. Now I'll be on my way to pay a visit to Moore's address, see what I can find. If either one of them sent the letter and has the DVD, I'll get it and we'll finish this up real quick. And if you don't finish it up real quick, what then? Then the search goes on. In the meantime, I'll pretend to be a security guy and look around the house. While I'm doing that, I'll talk to your staff. I put the check in my pocket, nodded at Worth, and left the house. On the way to my truck, I realized that my dislike for the man had lessened, and I was feeling sorry for the guy. Stanley Moore lived in a basement apartment of a renovated factory on the near west side of St. Louis. The building had once been a cardboard box plant. I knew that the lofts and top-floor apartments were expensive, but the ones below street level, in what would be called the basement, were usually much cheaper. I walked down a short flight of stairs to number 1C and knocked on his door. No one answered, but the door to the next apartment was open, and an elderly lady looked into the hallway. He's not at home, she offered. Said he was going to visit his sister in Baldwin. Supposed to be back tomorrow? Thank you, ma'am. I handed her my card. Would you call me when he gets home? That is if you happen to notice. My bet was that the old lady noticed everything that went on in the building. I've got a job offer for him. That's why you want to see him? She asked. Sort of an interview? Yes, ma'am. I'd like to know more about him. You know what kind of person he is and such? Stanley is a nice young man, always courteous and helpful to me. Does he live here alone? Or does he have a roommate? No, he's alone. But recently he has a friend visiting him a lot. At least until those two ruffians came to see him. He left right after that, and I haven't seen him since. I don't like his friend. He's not very nice. The old lady shook her head. Last week, I was trying to get my little pull cart through the door and was having trouble. He was walking down the hall to Stanley's, and I asked him to give me a hand. He looked at me, smiled, and started clapping his hands. Then he went into Stanley's. That wasn't a nice thing to do, I said, shaking my head. To me, it would have been funny if after clapping the guy helped her through the door. The guy is a shit, I thought. Maybe I'll get a chance to meet him while I'm looking for Stanley. Maybe I'll have to show him that manners can be taught as well as learned. What does this friend look like, and do you know this man's name? Not really. Stanley calls him RJ, but I've never heard his name. He's about your height with really dark hair, combed straight back. I think it's a dye job. Big shoulders and well-built but sneaky looking, if you know what I mean. I bet his name is Slick. She paused for a little and added, It's a shame Stanley lost his job. It wasn't his fault, you know. Really? That hussy seduced Stanley, and when her husband found out, Stanley got fired. Stanley is just a young man and didn't stand a chance against that woman's wiles. Of course her husband was going to find out as many times as that woman came over here. The husband, Worth I think is his name, blackballed Stanley, so he's having a hard time finding a job. You've seen her? Oh yes, many times. She'd ring the bell and then walk down to Stanley's apartment like she owned the place. She was always dressed a little too risque. Short tight skirts or shorts, tank tops or blouses. A trollop and chippy, if you know what I mean. Thank you for your time, Mrs. I am Irma Foley. I'll call you when Stanley gets back. Nodding, I turned and left the building. I drove back to the Worths. Time to play security consultant and talk to the other employees. Samuel let me into the house and led me to the sitting room. Mr. Worth had to go out for a while, but he left the information you requested in here, he said, pointing to the desk in the corner. If you need anything, push the button and Millie or Jacqueline will be right here. Samuel nodded and left the room. There were several folders stacked in the middle of the desk. I sat down and saw the button that would summon the help. Must be nice, I thought. You want a sandwich or something, so you just push a button and there you go. Instant gratification. I started to read the employee information folders. Samuel and Millie Ripley were husband and wife. They were both about 57 years old. They'd worked for Jason Worth for more than 20 years. Jacqueline was their niece and was 21. She'd come to live and work with them 3 years ago when her parents were killed in an auto accident. Ralph James was the driver or chauffeur or whatever. He'd only been with the Worths for 2 years. Something nagged at the back of my mind as I read the folders. I read and reread the information, but whatever was tugging at my brain stayed hidden. Let it alone, I thought. It'll come to you. The next thing to do was make a security inspection around the house and grounds. I walked around the interior of the house, including the second story, inspecting the windows and exterior doors. As I walked, I made notations in a notebook I carried. Have to look the part, don't you know? I made my way into the kitchen where Millie and Jacqueline were making lunch and Samuel was sitting at the kitchen table reading. I walked over to Samuel. He looked up and said, "Just checking inventories. Tomorrow is shopping day." I inspected the doors and windows in the kitchen and generally got in Millie and Jacqueline's way. The third time I had to say, "Excuse me," or "I'm sorry." Samuel smiled and suggested, "Let's go outside and have a cup of coffee, Mr. Steele. At least until the girls finish preparing lunch." We stepped outside onto a patio and sat on a very nicely carved wooden bench. "Who are you really, and what are you doing here, Mr. Steele?" Samuel asked. He wasn't angry, just inquisitive. "What makes you think I'm not a security consultant?" "You don't have the look," Samuel replied with a smile. "You look and act like a cop. This have anything to do with the demand for money Mr. Worth got?" "What demand for money?" Nobody gossips more, among themselves, than household help. Jacqueline saw the letter when she was cleaning in the sitting room. Samuel smiled and shook his head. "I didn't think the boy was smart enough to pull something like this." "What boy?" Samuel raised an eyebrow as he looked at me. "Guess I wasn't the only one that could use that trick. Don't play dumb, Mr. Steele. It doesn't suit you. Stanley Moore sent that letter demanding a lot of money for a DVD that's supposed to show Mrs. Worth and him, or Stanley would make it public." Samuel chuckled. "I don't know why Mr. Worth would pay money to keep what is common knowledge secret." Now it was my turn to raise an eyebrow. "The DVD is common knowledge?" "Not the DVD in particular, but Mrs. Worth's, well, antics are. Everyone already knows about her lifestyle." "Everyone?" He nodded his head. "I've heard people talking about her at some of the parties Mr. Worth has here." "How do they react to Mrs. Worth's, antics?" "Some of the men want to be next. Some wonder why Mr. Worth puts up with her." He smiled again. "And most of the women call her some not very nice names. Of course, none of their opinions are voiced to Mr. or Mrs. Worth face to face." "And do you and Millie disapprove of Mrs. Worth and her actions?" "It's not up to us to approve or disapprove. We're simply the hired help." "I find that hard to believe, Samuel." "Okay, you got me," he said with a small grin. "Millie and I worked for Mr. Worth before Miss Susan came into the picture. His first wife, Miss Rebecca, was a really nice person and we loved her. When she died, Mr. Worth was a mess for a while and then he brought Susan home." Samuel looked thoughtful for a few seconds and continued, "We were happy for him because he seemed to come back to life. But now? Well, we were here before she came and we'll still be here if she leaves. Our loyalty belongs to Mr. Worth. She only counts as long as Mr. Worth wants or lets her stay." Suddenly, as I was talking to Samuel, the thing that had nagged at me when I read the employee files jumped to the forefront of my mind. RJ was the friend that visited Moore and Ralph James was the driver. Where would the chauffeur be right now? Ralph? He's probably in his apartment over the garage, if he's not working on one of the cars. "Thanks, Samuel. You're a very astute man." I turned and walked toward the garage. I remember seeing Ralph's picture in the employee records. The picture fit the description that Mrs. Foley had given. I found Ralph James in the garage polishing a Bentley. "Hi, I'm Matt Steele." I introduced myself to Ralph. "I'm doing a security inspection for Mr. Worth." "Yeah, I heard you'd be around. I am Ralph James." "Nice car," I offered, pointing at the Bentley. "It's a Continental GT V8. You drive it much, Ralph?" "No, not this one. It's Mr. Worth's baby. I usually drive the Rolls when I take them someplace." "You know Stanley Moore?" I asked, watching his eyes. "Not really, just that he took care of the pool before he was fired." "Why?" "Part of the security check." "You haven't seen him since he was let go then?" "No, like I said, we weren't friends or anything." "You know why he was fired?" "Mr. Worth didn't tell me, just that he'd had to let Moore go." Ralph hesitated, looked around to make sure we were alone and replied, "Stan got caught banging Mrs. Worth, from what I hear. Her husband caught them or found out about it and sent the boy packing." Ralph snorted and continued, "Mr. Worth not only fired Stanley, but he put the word out to all his rich friends that he'd had to fire him. The sleazeball chuckled. I think he told them that Stanley stole something. Anyway, Stan can't get a job from the wealthy now, and the regular people can't pay enough to support his acting gigs. Worth also sent a couple of goons over to Stanley's place to teach the boy a lesson. Stanley got away, or wasn't there from what I hear. For a guy that's not Moore's friend, you sure know a lot about what went on after he got fired, I remarked. Gossip, just gossip. The house staff is the biggest hotbed of gossip in the world, Ralph said. But I keep my ears open and my mouth shut. I also keep my pants on where Mrs. Worth is concerned. She's as hot as any woman I've ever seen. But I like this job and don't plan on ending up like Stanley. She ever come on to you? No, but I've seen her looking, you know. Ralph preened a bit. Why is a security consultant so interested in what's going on? Disgruntled or ex-employees are a security risk, I answered. I gave Ralph what I hoped was a disarming smile and added, I'm just trying to gauge what a danger Stanley Moore might be. Thanks for your help. You're doing a nice job on the Bentley. As I walked away, I knew that Ralph was lying about his relationship with Stanley Moore. In spite of his saying the house was awash with gossip, how would he know about the men Worth supposedly sent over to the boy's apartment? I went to find Samuel again. If anyone knew anything, he'd be the one. Hey Samuel, can I talk to you again? I asked as I entered the kitchen. He gave me a little grin, nodded, and followed me outside. You know anything about Mr. Worth sending men over to Stanley's? Did Mr. Worth do that? He asked. It's the first I've heard of it. Samuel thought for a moment. If Mr. Worth did, it was to get that DVD you mentioned and maybe rough the boy up a bit. You know, for having the gall to try and blackmail Mr. Worth. Thanks, Samuel. Is Mr. Worth back yet? Samuel nodded, and I went looking for my employer. I found him in the sitting room, drinking another glass of whiskey. He nodded when I walked in and held up his glass, offering me a drink. I shook my head and joined him at his desk. I got another letter this afternoon, he said, handing me another printed page. It said that Worth would be contacted on Saturday morning and told where to bring the money. The printed signature was again Stanley Moore. Did you send 2 goons over to Moore's apartment? The look I gave him made it plain what I thought about it. I did, but not to attack him, Worth answered. I thought they might be able to get the DVD. Pretty dumb, Mr. Worth. Stanley booked, and with him, any chance at getting the DVD without paying for it. I shook my head. Not the smartest move on your part. What now, Mr. Steele? Worth seemed to deflate in his chair, as if he'd lost all confidence that he'd be able to get out of this bad situation. I'll keep looking for him. Hopefully I can find him before the week is out. I had serious doubts that Stanley was the blackmailer. From what I'd learned about the boy, I didn't think he was smart enough to come up with this DVD scheme. I didn't share my suspicions with Worth. I'll see you this evening, I said, and went home to see if I did in fact have a clean pair of jeans. Jason and Susan Worth were surprised and a little pleased that I cleaned up so well. I was wearing a light brown cashmere sports jacket over a white-on-white brother to the blue Christian Dior that Worth had worn that morning. My tie was loose around my neck and was a very dark brown knit. My slacks were a dark brown and had a crease so sharp you could have cut paper with it. I still wore cowboy boots, so sue me, I like boots, but these were dress boots, good for dancing but not working. My, aren't you splendorous? Susan said as she greeted me. She carried a very large glass containing what looked like a martini drowning an olive. Good evening, Mrs. Worth, Mr. Worth. He'd just joined us at the entry to the large ballroom. That's not the first of the evening for Susan, I thought. If I'd thought Susan was a distraction in my office or early today, tonight she'd stop traffic at rush hour. The deep green, low-cut, flowing dress she wore went perfectly with her hair color. Her hair was swept up in some kind of style that left her sexy neck and shoulders bare. Satan, get thee behind me, I said to myself, not for the first time. Let me introduce you around, Mr. Steele, Susan offered. Mr. Worth stepped in and took my arm. I'll see to Mr. Steele, darling. Why don't you see to the other guests? You're no fun, Jason. Patting me on the arm, Susan said, I'll see you later, Mr. Steele. Apparently, Susan's anger at me from earlier that day had been replaced by what she considered a challenge. I nodded at her and let Worth steer me toward the bar. He held up 2 fingers to the bartender, and shortly we both had a generous glass of Gentleman Jack. Samuel was right. It's good to be king. That tall, blonde fellow over by the fireplace is Danby Summers, Worth told me. Danby had the look of the idle rich. He was tanned, athletic-looking, and I guess women would think he was handsome. He reminded me of some of the men I'd seen when I spent summers in Texas with my granddad. He held their type in contempt. Granddad described them as big hat, no cattle, Danby would have fit right in, I thought. He doesn't have the stomach for blackmail, Mr. Worth. It's not him, and he's not a threat to your marriage. How can you be sure, Mr. Steele? You haven't ever met or talked to him. I've seen his type before. His biggest concern is the next party or the next playmate that won't cause him a lot of trouble. I took a long drink of the whiskey. As for Susan, I mean Mrs. Worth, I think she's just pulling your chain about good old Danby. Pointing to where Susan stood talking to two other women, I added. She hasn't been around him or even looked at him. He's been here several times during the last 2 weeks, sometimes while I was at the office, Worth explained. And every time I am around them, she, well, I guess the term is flirts with him. You know, makes all kinds of double-meaning phrases and gives him seductive looks. Mr. Worth, your wife could give seductive looks brushing her teeth. Like I said, she's pulling your chain. Why would she do that? Look, I'm not a marriage counselor or anything, it's just my opinion. So you don't think Susan had or is having an affair with Danby Summers? Nope. What about Stanley Moore? Oh, I think she and old Stan did hook up. Why would she do that? I mean so blatantly. Worth seemed to be really upset. This wasn't the same guy that came into my office and acted like the world was his oyster. Makes me wonder if he was more than half in love with the woman, I thought. In spite of her actions. I've had no training in the warm and fuzzy stuff, but I have met a lot of people in my line of work. Maybe she thinks you're not paying enough attention to her, that you're spending too much time at the office. Maybe she's mad because you forgot her birthday or your anniversary. Or maybe she is just a bitch. You're asking the wrong person, Mr. Worth. I suggest you ask your wife. Susan picked that moment to come over and latch onto my arm. Come, Mr. Steele, let me introduce you around. I'm not here to socialize, Mrs. Worth. I'm working. But if you don't want everyone to know what and who you are, you should act like just another guest. Don't you think? Susan looked at me with a challenge. Her eyes silently told me that if I didn't, she'd tell everyone why I was actually at the cocktail party. Go ahead, Mr. Steele, Worth offered. Susan's right. I don't want everyone to know I've hired a detective to protect our reputation. Lead on, Mrs. Worth, I said and put down my empty glass. So began a round of introductions to people I had no interest in and would probably never see again. There was a cornucopia of Brads and Chads and of course Danby. Not a John or Bob or Jim in the bunch. There was a plethora of Tiffany's and Heathers and Daphnes. Not a Mary or Sally or Jane in that group. Quite a collection of phony intellectuals, trust fund babies, and wannabes, I thought. After making the circuit of the room, I escaped and headed back to my favorite person in the room, the bartender. I got a gentleman jack and turned. Standing in front of me was a girl, no, a woman, that would give Susan Worth a run for her money in the looks department. I see you survived the ordeal of introductions, she said with a humorous smile. Seriously wounded, but I made it, I replied. Hello, I am Matt Steele. This was one woman I wanted to know better, and I'd made no promises about keeping away from her. More introductions? She asked, the smile growing. I am Abigail Stewart. She extended her hand, and we shook as I looked her over. Abigail was about 5'8", with an athletic body slightly slimmer than Susan Worth. There was no doubt that she was all women. Her hair was strawberry blonde and cut in a pixie style that made her green eyes and full lips stand out. Abigail had a smattering of freckles across her nose. Do I pass? She asked. Huh. I cleverly responded. I'm a silver-tongued devil when I put my mind to it. You're staring, so I wonder if I passed your inspection. Don't be coy, Miss Stewart. I think you know you'd pass any inspection by anybody with a pulse, I said with a grin. A girl can never be too sure, you know. Please call me Abby. I've never seen you here before. Who are you besides Matt Steele? I'm just a business associate of Mr. Worth's. That's a shame. A shame that I do business with Mr. Worth? No, that you couldn't think of a better cover than a business associate. At the shocked look on my face, she almost giggled and said in a softer voice, I know that you're a private investigator and I know you're looking into a blackmail scheme against Jason. Busted. I said. How do you know? I tried to cover my tracks. You can't keep secrets from the household staff. They've got better intel than the CIA. She laughed again. Besides, Jacqueline and I are friends. I met her at school. My face must have dropped a little, or Abby saw the disappointment in my eyes. I never did have a good poker face where women were concerned. Why that look? She asked. I shook my head. Busted again, I answered with a sigh. If you must know, I was hoping to get to know you better, maybe catch a movie or got to dinner or something. But if you went to school with Jacqueline, well, I hesitated, trying to think of a way to say what I was thinking and not make myself look like an idiot. Well, what? Jacqueline is 21, so you must be about the same age. As beautiful as you are, you're much too young for me, or maybe it's I'm too old for you. Thank you, kind sir. Again, I must have shown my puzzlement. I said I met Jackie at school. I never said anything about being in her class. I teach at Forest Park Community College, English Lit. Jackie was in a couple of my classes, and we became friends. At the chance of being indelicate or gauche, just how old are you, Abby? A lady never likes to tell her age. She grinned and added, but this time I'll make an exception. I'll be 32 next month. The smile covered my face. Well, if I can get her interested, at least I won't be robbing the cradle, I thought. As soon as I get my foot out of my mouth, would you like to join me for a drink out on the patio? I'd love to, Mr. Steele. I've never seen someone extricating a foot from their mouth. It might be interesting. We found a wrought iron bench, sat down, and began to get to know each other. I learned Abby had grown up in a small town in southeastern Missouri. It was about 60 miles from the small town where I'd spent most of my summer vacations when my family moved to St. Louis the year I turned 15. I learned that she loved the outdoors with fishing, canoeing, and camping among her favorites. After almost an hour, I asked the question I should have asked at the beginning of our talk. Do you belong to someone? Does someone belong to you? Abby smiled and chuckled. I mean, are you in a relationship or married or anything? Married? Not anymore. Abby touched my arm. I've been happily divorced for 2 years. That's good, I said. Now it was her that had a shocked look. It means I can ask you to dinner. Shaking her head, but smiling, Abby asked, when? When I finish the job for Mr. Worth, I'll call you. I leaned closer to Abby and quickly kissed her. That's a deposit, full payment to come later. There will be a penalty if payment becomes past due, she said as she stood. We'd better get back inside before Jason sends out a search party. He pays that much attention to you? I asked. Please don't tell me you're running with Worth like Susan does her men, I thought. My good old poker face must have given me away again. Jason is a relative, sort of. He's my godfather. My father and he were best friends in college and did a lot of business together after they started their careers. Daddy was best man at Uncle Jason's wedding to his first wife. My father passed away last year, but if he'd been here, he might have stopped Uncle Jason's marriage to Susan. I tried to butt. Yeah, the heart wants what the heart wants and logic or good sense don't come into it, I said as we started back into the house. My, how profound, Matt. You have the heart of a poet. Abby was smiling. I didn't know if she was making fun of me or not. No, I just read that someplace. Seems to fit in Jason's case. When we stepped through the French doors into the house, Jason came hurriedly over to us. I'm not paying you to seduce my goddaughter, Mr. Steele. I'll thank you to attend to business. Uncle Jason, stop it, Abby responded. I don't need anyone protecting me, and no one's ever been able to seduce me into doing something I didn't want to do. Good thing she spoke up, I thought. I was about to tell Worth to go to hell and take his cheating wife with him. But you're just a youngster, Abigail, Jason protested. She's about the same age as your wife, Mr. Worth, I put in. If you need to protect someone, I suggest you take care of Susan. Mentally shrugging my shoulders, I said to myself, just couldn't keep your mouth shut, could you? Oh well, I was looking for a job when I found this one. Worth's face turned red in anger like he was going to erupt. Then he exhaled very loudly and the anger drained from his face. You're right, of course, Mr. Steele. I'll mingle for a while longer and catch up with you tomorrow morning, Mr. Worth. Join me for breakfast at 8 if you like, Mr. Steele. We can discuss our options in more depth. I nodded and turned to Abby. I'll call you when I complete my work. Worth wasn't overjoyed at my statement, but didn't say anything. How long must I wait? Abby asked. She was smiling and pulling my chain. Today's Tuesday. I should be finished by Saturday. That's soon, both Abby and Worth said. I'm not only good, but I'm fast too, I replied. See you tomorrow morning, Mr. Worth. I walked around the party for another half hour and left. The valet didn't seem to be too happy bringing my truck to me after driving all the luxury and sports cars, but became happier when I tipped him $10. Samuel let me in the next morning and led me to the very large kitchen. I would have thought Mr. Worth would eat in the dining room, I remarked to Samuel. He does when Mrs. Worth joins him for a meal. That isn't too often, except for dinner now and then. Steele, have a seat. Worth greeted me. Millie, would you get Mr. Steele some coffee and breakfast, please? Just coffee, Millie, thank you. I seldom eat breakfast, Mr. Worth. Slows me down. Suit yourself, he said and dug into a large plate of eggs, sausage, and country fried potatoes. He looks different today, I thought. More relaxed, not so much tension. I usually have that effect on people. Worth was wearing designer jeans, designer but jeans nonetheless, an oversized sweatshirt with a Missouri University logo, and sneakers. I've never seen him without his three-piece suit and a frown. He wasn't exactly smiling this morning, but he didn't have the perpetual scowl on his face either. I watched Susan and Danby closely last night, Worth offered. A couple of times he tried to put his arm around Susan or hold her hand, and she slapped him away. She finally told him to leave her alone, or she'd have him put off the property. I think you're right, there's nothing going on there. Very good coffee, Millie, I said. Like I said, Mr. Worth, I think she's just pulling your chain a bit. How did you learn so much about people? This wasn't the same guy that waltzed into my office acting like he owned the world. I might ever get to like him a little. Years of doing police and detective work, Mr. Worth. You've got to be able to read people, their facial expressions, body language, voice inflection, if you want to be a good detective. Susan came through the kitchen in a rush. She was dressed in a very short white tennis skirt and a white wife-beater type top. Join us for breakfast, dear, Worth suggested. I can't. I have a tennis lesson with Sam and then lunch with Tiffany and Heather, Susan answered. I'll see you at dinner, Jason. Toodles. I watched through the picture window as Susan ran to a bright red Mercedes SL 550 convertible. She threw her duffel in the passenger seat, jumped in and peeled rubber down the long curving driveway. That car goes for about $100,000, I thought. Worth had told me why he kept Susan around, even with her affairs and actions. Now I saw in bright red why Susan didn't leave. She was a money-hungry, gold-digging bitch. My cell phone rang. Excuse me, I said and answered the call. Mr. Steele? This is Irma Foley. I'm the one you talked to about Stanley Moore. Yes, Mrs. Foley, I remember you. Stanley is here, in his apartment. He said he was going to California to live with some friends. Thank you, Mrs. Foley. I'm on my way. Be there in 30 minutes or less. If he tries to leave, is there any way you can stall him until I get there? I don't want you to cause trouble for you, but I could use your help. Mr. Steele, I don't believe your interest is about a job interview. The old woman had me. Why do you want to see Stanley? Mrs. Foley, Stanley is being accused of a crime. I don't think he's involved, but I need to talk to him so I can help him. There was silence on the line and I said, I give you my word, Mrs. Foley. If Stanley is innocent like I believe, I'll help him. If he's guilty, I'll see he goes to jail. After several seconds that seemed more like an hour, Mrs. Foley answered. I believe I can trust you, Mr. Steele. Stanley said a friend was coming by to pick him up at 4. He'll be here until then. Thank you again, Mrs. Foley. I hung up and looked at my watch. That gives me 40 minutes to get to Stanley's and have a little talk with him, I thought. I waved at Mr. Worth and hurried to my truck. Now the big block V8 was going to come in handy. When I got to the apartment building, I pushed the button for Mrs. Foley's apartment. She looked out a window, saw it was me, and buzzed me in. Stanley's still in his apartment, she said. I didn't tell him you were coming. Nodding my thanks, I walked carefully down the hallway to 1C. I listened at the door for a few seconds and tried the doorknob. The door was unlocked, and I pushed it open quickly. Moore glanced up and got a scared look on his face. He picked up a heavy table lamp, held it like a club as he started toward me. Get the hell out of my apartment, Stanley ordered. Son, your mouth is writing checks your body can't cash, I said. I pulled my Cardinals jacket to the side and showed my Glock. I'm not going to hurt you. I just want to talk to you. Did Worth send you? He asked. Yeah, but I'm not like the other two he sent. I'm not here to rough you up. He looked skeptical and I said, put down the lamp and let's talk. Stanley still looked like he might run, so I closed the door and leaned against it. I'm a private investigator hired to find you. You're being accused of blackmail. Something about a DVD of you and Mrs. Worth. The young man stared at me for several seconds and then sort of melted onto his sofa. I don't know nothing about any blackmail letter or DVD. First time I heard about a letter or a DVD was when those two goons Mr. Worth sent over asked me about it. I told them, like I told you. I don't know nothing about them. He dropped his head and shook it. Stanley finally looked up at me. Susan, I mean Mrs. Worth, and I did get it on, but I never recorded it. Where did you and Mrs. Worth usually get together? It was only a couple of times here, and once we used Ralph's apartment over the garage. He was driving Mr. Worth around to meetings that day. How did you get away from Worth's men? I was holding my door trying to keep them from coming in. Mrs. Foley came out of her apartment and yelled at them to leave me alone, or she'd call the cops. When they turned to look at her, I booked out the back. Went to my sister's in Baldwin. Today's the first day I've been back here. Mr. Worth has 2 letters asking for money. They both had your name at the bottom. Wasn't me. Isn't me. All I want is to go to California. Mr. Worth has made it damn hard for me to get work here, so I'm heading out there. I can't find any pool work, and he even got me blackballed at the Muni. All I want is out of St. Louis. There are lots of pools to take care of in California and a lot more acting jobs. I believe you, Stanley, and I have an idea of who sent the letters. Looking at the boy, I saw him perk up. But Stanley, you're going to have to put off your trip for one day. What do you want me to do, Mr. Steele? His voice was tired and fearful. You'll have to play a part, Stanley, but from what I hear, you're a pretty good actor. The young man actually smiled. He was pleased with the praise for his acting ability. I didn't know if he was good or not. All that was necessary was for him to do what I said. Why do you care, Mr. Steele? I mean, you could just take me to Mr. Worth, collect your money and walk away. Mr. Worth hired me to solve a problem for him. I took the job, so I'll do my best to get it done. Guess you could say it's pride in my work or something. I explained what I wanted him to do and when. At first, Stanley shook his head but came around when I explained about his role the next day. He finally gave me a little smile, and I could see the wheels turning. And Stanley, don't even think about running. If you do, Mr. Worth will send more guys after you, and I'll be one of them. You can't hide from me in the Hollywood scene, and you really don't want to see me angry. I gave him what I thought was a fierce look. You really don't want to see me angry. I repeated and patted the butt of my weapon. There was a knock on the door behind me. I raised an eyebrow at Stanley. That's my friend Jimmy. He's an actor too. We're going to California together, Stanley replied to my silent question. I opened the door and let Jimmy into the apartment. If they ever do a remake of The Incredible Hulk, they should hire Jimmy. He could play the part without any computer animation. Jimmy stood about 6'6" and weighed close to 300 pounds, and none of it was slack belly. The boy had wide shoulders and a torso that tapered down to a waist not much bigger than mine. He was wearing shorts that showed his tree trunk legs and a crop top t-shirt that showed his stomach. Jimmy had a 12-pack instead of a 6-pack for abdominals. If this kid wants to cause trouble, there ain't much I can do about it, I thought. Stanley has a favor to ask of you, Jimmy. I hope you'll help him out. Cool, Jimmy said. He went to the refrigerator, grabbed a beer, and flopped down on the sofa. What a neat Stan. Nodding at Stanley, I left and returned to the Worths, thankful that Jimmy was a peaceful giant. I parked my truck on the side driveway, walked around to the back of the house, and found Millie in the kitchen. Mrs. Ripley, where's Samuel? I'd like to talk to him. Please call me Millie. Everyone does? Sam is down at the garage. Something about a broken water pipe or something. I found Samuel on his cell phone, standing by a puddle of water. No, the day after tomorrow won't do. He listened for a few seconds. Did I mention that I'm calling for Mr. Jason Worth? Samuel listened again and smiled. Thank you. Have your man come around to the back of the house and ask for me. He looked over to me where I waited and smiled. Mr. Worth is sort of a king around here. It's good to be king if you want something done quickly. You know, you remind me of a former Marine gunnery sergeant I know. He ran the police pistol range, and without Tully, a lot of young cops would never have been able to qualify and nothing would have gotten done. I smiled at Samuel and said, without you, nothing would get done around here either. You can put away the soft soap, Mr. Steele, Samuel said. What do you need? I was wondering if you could get me into Ralph's apartment up there. I'd like to look around when he's not here. So you think Ralph is involved in the DVD mess? He looked at me, and when I didn't answer, he said, come on, this is as good a time as any. Ralph took the Bentley to the dealership, so he'll be gone another couple of hours. Samuel took a key ring out of his vest and motioned me to follow him. Climbing the stairs to the second story of the garage, Samuel unlocked the door and stepped aside to let me into the apartment. I was carrying what looked like a camera bag. I'll wait downstairs, he said, and started to leave. I'd rather you stay, Samuel. If I find anything I want to witness, I don't want anyone saying I planted evidence just to earn my fee. He nodded, came inside, and sat on the couch. Looking around the apartment, I thought, pretty nice digs. The space was almost as large as the garage area below. It was one large room, about 40 by 30, combining living area, sleeping area, and a galley-style kitchen with a large table separating the kitchen and living room. The only interior walls were where a full bath had been added to the space. Yep, pretty nice digs. I walked around just looking over the apartment and came to a stop in front of a large bookcase against the wall closest to the bed. Ralph doesn't impress me as being a heavy reader. Turning to Samuel, I asked, you think Ralph has read all these books? Samuel shook his head and smiled. Motor Trend, Car and Driver, or Playboy is more his style. Stepping to the case, I started looking closely at the books. There were two that seemed different than the others, and I tried to pull them from the shelf. The two books were actually one piece. They both came away in my hand. Behind the false front of the books was a video camera. I inspected it and found that it recorded to a disc you could use to make a DVD. That's just about what I figured, I said, mostly to myself. Samuel joined me in front of the bookcase. You thought all along that Stanley wasn't the one that made the DVD, didn't you? Nodding, I replied, yeah. And when Stanley's neighbor described the guy visiting him lately, I got suspicious of Ralph. I think he's the one sent the letters and typed Stanley's name to them, and this pretty much proves it. What are you going to do, now that you know? Samuel asked with a look on his face that told me what he would do. Well, I've a little plan. Seeing the look in Samuel's eyes, I quickly added, and breaking his neck isn't part of it. Explaining my idea, I said, that's why I brought this little darling with me. Opening the camera bag, I took out another video recorder. I replaced Ralph's recorder with my unit and returned the false book to the shelf. About 3 hours from now is when the balloon goes up and my equipment will not only record, but it will transmit what it's recording to my laptop. I can watch everything in real time as well as record it for backup. Also, Stanley is wearing a wire. If everything goes right, we'll have this taken care of by supper time. I gave him an evil grin and added, then I'll get out of your hair, Samuel. Samuel chuckled as we left, making sure to relock the apartment. You'd make a pretty good gunnery sergeant yourself, Mr. Steele. 2 hours later, Ralph returned with the Bentley, parking it in its own special place in the garage. The sleek, beautiful automobile, calling it a car was an insult, sat alone in the garage with a 10-foot space on either side. No accidental banging a door into this vehicle. Ralph saw me leaning on the fender of my beat-up, but dependable truck. You ought to think about upgrading your ride, he said with a sort of sneer on his face. Man in your line of work should advertise his success. I sure can't afford something like that, I replied, pointing to the Bentley. Got a friend at the dealership, Ralph informed me. He could get you a fantastic deal on one. Ralph pulled out his wallet. Let me give you his card. Tell him I sent you. As he was digging for the card, Jimmy drove up with Stanley. He got out of the car with Jimmy trailing him, and they walked over to me. I brought my friend as backup, Stanley said with a little arrogance. You know, in case there's any trouble. Okay, Stanley, I said. I'll go get Mr. Worth. I turned and walked toward the house. As I walked around the corner of the garage, I slipped behind it to one of the exit doors on the backside of the building. Entering the garage, I crouched behind the cars to stay out of sight. Now it was up to Stanley. Ralph put his hand on Stanley's shoulder, but quickly took it off at a grunt from Jimmy. What are you doing here, Stan? I thought you'd be gone by now. I was gonna leave, but I didn't want my reputation to get dragged through the mud. So I came to see Mr. Worth. Stanley sounded very concerned and very sincere. Glancing around, Ralph said, let's go up to my place and talk for a minute, Stan. No need to let everyone know your business. He pointed to Samuel, who was dealing with the plumber. Stanley followed Ralph up the stairs to the apartment. Ralph looked around to see if anyone had seen them and then closed the door. I quickly ran out to my truck, powered up the laptop, and waited for the fireworks. Stanley, you should be halfway to California by now. Worth's gonna put you in jail if you hang around, Ralph said. I know I might go to jail, but I didn't do anything wrong, well, except for going to bed with Mrs. Worth, that is. Thanks for your help the last couple of weeks, but I can't leave with my name in the dirt, Stanley said. What are you going to do? Ralph asked. I'm going to give Mr. Worth this, Stanley answered and pulled a DVD from his jacket. I'm gonna tell him I didn't send the letters and don't want any money. Then I'll be able to go to California, free and clear. You've got a DVD of you and Mrs. Worth too? Ralph asked. He didn't seem to be able to believe his bad luck. Look, Stanley, I was the one that sent the letters to Worth. I mean, he's got more money than he can ever use. Why shouldn't we get a piece of it? Stanley followed the script and shook his head. I don't want to be thought of as a blackmailer. What do you care what a bunch of rich people here in Missouri think about you? Ralph said. He felt that his payday was flying away. Let me get the money and I'll send you half. That way we both make out. I was watching and listening to the conversation on my laptop. This is cool, I thought. I've got the perp and didn't have to do anything but outsmart him. I heard Ralph confess and thought, that's all I need. I called a friend of mine that I'd had waiting just outside the entrance to the Worth estate. Hey Frank, I've got the prick on video and audio. Come on, let's grab the guy. The man I was talking to was Detective Frank Wins of the St. Louis Police. He and I had worked together before I'd been forced out of the department. In fact, he had been my training officer. Frank was now the lead detective in his precinct. A patrol car followed by Frank in his unmarked sedan pulled up next to my truck. Frank got out of his car and walked over to my truck. I pointed to the stairs leading up to Ralph's. Don't you want to be in on the takedown, Matt? Frank asked as he motioned the two patrolmen toward the stairs. Not into arresting people anymore, Frank, I replied. Besides, this guy is so slimy, I'd be afraid of getting my hands dirty. But it's okay for me and my men to get our hands dirty, Frank said. He was pretending to be angry. That's why they pay you the big bucks, Frank. Frank followed his men to the apartment. Very shortly, all 3 policemen returned leading Ralph, who was in handcuffs. You got nothing on me, Ralph claimed. It's my word against Stanley's. I held up my laptop. We've got you right here in living color and stereophonic sound. Well, maybe not stereo, but we got you on tape, buddy boy. That recording was made in my place without my consent. You can't use it in court, Ralph said smugly. You'd be right if it was really your place. But Mr. Worth owns it, and I have written permission from him to wire the garage and the apartment. I don't believe he gave you permission. Well, I will have by the time your case gets to court. I was the one that looked smug now. Steele, I'll see you again, Ralph threatened. His face was red with anger, and he tried to step toward me. Give me a second, will you, Frank? He nodded, and I walked Ralph 2 or 3 steps away from the cops. Frank and the 2 cops were intently studying cloud formations or the manicured lawn and making it a point not to watch Ralph and me. You may see me one time too many, Ralph, I told him as I looked into his eyes. It would be a very bad career move on your part. I don't think you'd like the results if we ever see each other again. I hadn't touched the man or even raised my voice to him, but the look I gave him left no doubt as to what I would do if I saw him again. Do we understand each other? Ralph tried to look me in the eye, but he couldn't hold my gaze. He must not have liked what he saw because he sort of slumped and nodded. Good. I walked him back to Frank and turned to Stanley. Nice job, Stanley. I praised the young man. I think you'll have success as an actor out in Hollywood. Stanley smiled. Thanks for clearing my name, Mr. Steele. He looked toward the house and saw Worth coming toward us. Tell Mr. Worth I'm sorry about Susan. Will you please? Come on, Jimmy, let's get the hell out of here. Give me a call, Stanley, and let me know where you are. We might need you to testify. Frank nodded his thanks and put the handcuffed Ralph in the back of the police unit. I handed him my laptop. I expect to get that back after your guys pull the recording off of it. I'll see it's returned to you, Matt, Frank told me and drove away. Who were those people? Worth asked as he got close to me. I explained my successful plan and that the DVD had been found and that Ralph was the actual blackmailer. Stanley didn't have anything to do with it. Well, except for sleeping with your wife. I let him go. Worth watched the police cars drive toward the main street. I guess I can't punish more for letting himself be seduced by Susan. He turned to me and gave me a little smile. Although, I would have liked to punch his lights out. He did say to tell you he was sorry. Said he couldn't help himself when Susan came on to him. I chuckled. Hell, Mr. Worth, almost any man would have jumped her. Yes, I understand, he replied. Susan can be a force of nature when she puts her mind to it. But why didn't you get with her? She made it obvious she was willing. Mr. Worth, you said you knew about my ex-wife. I couldn't do that to another man after what was done to me. I grinned and added, besides, you would have stopped payment on your check if I went with your wife. We both turned and looked down the driveway as we heard the roar of a powerful engine. Susan's Mercedes raced up to the garage and power slid to a stop. Before she got out of the car, I said, none of my business, but have you made a decision about Susan, Mr. Worth? He nodded and waited for Susan to join us. What was the police car doing here? Susan asked. Was that Stanley I saw leaving? Yes, it was, Worth answered. He was part of Mr. Steele's plan to catch the real blackmailer, Ralph. And if you hurry, you can catch up to him. Why ever would I want to go with that young lout? Susan asked. You don't have to go with him, my dear, but you do have to go, Worth answered. You can go with young Moore, or go to one of your other boy toys, or go to hell. But you're not staying here. You don't live here anymore. But Jason, Susan said as she leaned up against him, I don't want. It doesn't make any difference in what you want, Susan. You can take your car and your clothes. Hell, you can even take your jewelry. You've got 1 hour to pack and leave. Worth nodded at me and started toward the garage. He turned his head back toward his soon-to-be ex-wife. Contact my attorney when you get settled. You signed a prenuptial agreement, but I have made arrangements for you to get $50,000. Goodbye, Susan. She looked at me in disbelief. I shrugged my shoulders and held my hands out as if to say, what you gonna do? Susan began to trot toward the garage, but Worth's Bentley screamed out of the garage door and took off down the driveway. The sound of its powerful engine could be heard for a long time. What am I going to do now? Susan asked. It may have been a rhetorical question, but I answered her anyway. I suggest you get your butt in gear and get packed. I think good old Samuel there will toss you out in an hour. Samuel was standing halfway between the house and the garage with a satisfied smirk on his face. Millie and Jacqueline were right next to him. The last I saw of Mrs. Worth was her cute behind running toward the house. After retrieving my camera, I got into my truck and drove away. As I left the Worth estate, I said out loud, "Your free ride is over, Susan. Ain't karma a bitch?" "You like Italian?" I asked Abby. I had called her the day after solving Worth's little problem. "I love Italian, but I don't know a really good place," she answered. "Don't worry about it. I know the best place in town. Pick you up at 7. Abby lived in an old brick house across from Lafayette Park. It was an area of old stately homes that had fallen into favor with the renovation and yuppie crowd. I walked up to her door, rang the bell, and almost fell over when she answered. Abby was what they call stunning in a well-known little black dress, except it was in sunflower yellow. It was just short enough to be interesting and just low-cut enough to catch your eye. After catching my breath, I pulled my eyes back up to her face and greeted her. Then I led her down her front walk to the street. She looked around and asked with a smile, "Where's this ratty old truck I heard about?" Uncle Jason said it was the ugliest thing he'd ever seen. "He didn't like my truck?" I asked. How could anyone not like my faithful truck? Deplorable and embarrassing is what he called it. Abby was trying hard not to laugh. I told him that the truck was my work vehicle. "This is what I use for special occasions." I pointed to my '63 Corvette split window coupe. I had restored the Corvette and painted it Riverside Red, which was one of the original colors. Abby's face lit up and she actually giggled. "I've always loved the old Corvettes. Where did you find it?" "I bought it from an old lady in California about 6 years ago. Would you believe she lived in Pasadena?" "A little old lady from Pasadena?" Abby was now laughing. Her husband bought the car for her as a wedding present, and she kept it all these years until he passed away. I bought it and had it shipped here to St. Louis. Opening the door, I handed Abby into the car. As we left, I punched the engine a little to show off. "Where are we going?" "To a place on what used to be called Dago Hill before everyone got so politically correct. It's an area that a lot of Italians moved to when they immigrated to America. Every year the people have a big outdoor festival called Hill Day. If you want good Italian food, the Hill is the place to go." I am surprised you don't know about the Hill. I've led a somewhat sheltered life since moving to St. Louis when I was a teenager. Do you believe I'd never been on a tour of the Busch Brewery until last year? The Corvette made short work of the normal 15-minute drive, taking just under 10 minutes. I have a hard time keeping the vet under the speed limit. I parked in the lot next to the restaurant. Abby looked around with interest at the neighborhood and the building next to us. "This is Ragazzi's, the best Italian eatery in the city," I told her as we walked toward the front door. "Not only is the food very good, but it's like eating in someone's dining room. You'll see." I opened the door and we entered. "Hello. Welcome to Ragazzi's," the bartender yelled from across the room. "There's a table just to your left or a booth on your right. Have a seat and your waiter will be right with you." He turned to his left and yelled, "Hey Sal, there's a nice young couple in the front of the house. Take care of them, will ya?" Abby looked surprised. "Sort of informal, aren't they?" I asked, laughing. "Let's take the table so we can see what's going on," I suggested. Sal greeted us, handed us menus, and took our drink order. I convinced Abby to try one of Ragazzi's famous 24-ounce, frozen, fish bowls of beer. While Sal went for our drinks, I looked around the large room. At a back corner table I saw 3 men that I knew. Sal returned with the big mugs of beer, and we ordered our dinner. "Anything else, while you're waiting for your order?" Sal asked. I pointed to the 3 men sitting at the back of the restaurant. "See those 3 back there?" Sal turned his head. "Oh, those guys, sure. They're in here all the time." Nodding my head, I said, "Take them a round of drinks on me, please." I watched as Sal went to the bar, and then took 3 of the fish bowls to the table and set them down. At a question from the largest man at the table, Sal nodded in my direction. The big man raised his glass in a thank you and took a long drink. "Who are they?" Abby asked. "The one on the left is Frank Wins, in the middle is Raleigh Chambers, and the big guy on the right is Tully." "Do you know them?" Abby turned her head and took a long look at the 3 men. Tully raised his glass in a salute to her and smiled. "Oh yeah, I know them." "So how do you know them?" Abby asked. "Well, it's a long story," I answered. "It was like this." Before I could continue, someone came into the restaurant and walked over to our table. "Hello, Steele," Ralph said. "I told you I'd see you again." I nodded at him. "Out on bail, Ralph?" "No thanks to you," he answered. Turning to Abby, he asked, "And who is this pretty little thing?" "Don't ever go there, Ralph." I stood to face him. The look in my eyes and the tone of my voice made him skip whatever he'd planned to say to or about Abby. "Let's skip all the insults and threats and get to it. but I suggest we take it outside so we don't interrupt anyone's supper." Ralph stepped back, nodded, and headed outside. "You stay here, Abby. I'll be right back." I turned back toward the door. Ralph had already left. I followed, knowing I knew I had to handle this right now. As I stepped through the door, I felt a blow across my upper shoulders. I went to the ground and rolled, coming to my feet. The pain was bad, but I knew if I stayed down, I could be seriously injured or I might never get up. It would depend on Ralph, and I didn't think he would worry about my feelings too much. Standing, I faced Ralph. He had two companions with him, one of which held a short piece of 2x4 that he'd used to hit me. He looked surprised that I got up. Either one of the two men could have played linebacker for the St. Louis Rams. "I know you don't have any friends that would help you with this, Ralph. How much are these guys costing you?" The situation was already at critical mass, so I don't know why I tried to get a rise out of him. "Whatever it is, it'll be worth it," Ralph said in a very angry voice. "Guess I got to him after all. And don't think about using your gun. We've got guns too." His two cohorts pulled back their jackets. One had a pistol in a shoulder holster. The other had one at his hip. One of the many things that Tully had taught me and others was that in a fight, be it with fists, knives, or guns, you must act first. The ones that postured or talked trash or hesitated usually lost. My Glock just appeared in my hand. I'm sure the three facing me thought it was magic. If this had been 150 years ago, my draw would have put me in the running for the fastest gun in the West. Motioning with my weapon at the two carrying guns, I ordered, "Now boys, with your left hand and using two fingers, pull your pistols and toss them in front of me." The larger of the two sneered at me. "There's two of us. You can't get us both. Want to bet your life on that?" I pointed the .45 at him. "Maybe you're right, but I'm gonna get you first. You won't care what happens after that." Another voice spoke out. "I think the boy has a point," Tully said, holding his own Glock down beside his leg. "Might be a good idea to do what Steele says." Also, Frank and Raleigh were standing next to Tully with their Glocks at the ready. One of the men moved a little too fast for my taste. "Slowly, guys. This Glock has a hair trigger, and we wouldn't want to have an accident, would we?" I didn't expect an answer. It was a rhetorical question. "Now why don't you guys step over here with us?" Frank said. "Let Mr. James and Mr. Steele finish their conversation." Tully motioned to Ralph's hired muscle and put them up against the brick wall. "Assume the position, gentlemen. I'm sure you've done it before." Frank quickly searched them. When he finished, he said, "You two just stand there. Don't get involved in this." Raleigh turned from watching the frisk job. "You're on, Matt. I suggest you get to it before some good soul calls the police." I kicked the two pistols on the ground in front of me into the gutter. Making sure my weapon was safe, I holstered it. "Was there something you wanted to talk to me about, Ralph?" He wasn't as confident as when he had help. Hesitating for several seconds, he finally picked up the 2x4 and rushed me. I stepped inside the arc of his swing, and a hard left hand over his right eye stopped his headlong rush, and he dropped the board. A straight right to his midsection bent him over, and another left put him on the ground. Ralph was done. I knelt beside him. "Now, Ralph, pay attention. I don't want to have this conversation again. Do you understand?" He nodded, and I added, "Say it, Ralph. I want to make sure you've gotten the message." He coughed and said in a trembling voice, "I understand." "Good boy," I replied and stood. "He's all yours, Frank, again." "Ralph James, you're under arrest for assault. Assault with a deadly weapon, assault with intent, and for being stupid." Turning to the two linebacker wannabes, he said, "You two beat it before I turn Tully loose on you." To the rest of us, he said, "I'll call for a patrol car to take him to the precinct," Frank said. "I haven't finished my dinner." Turning around, I said, "Thanks, guys." To Raleigh and Tully. They both smiled and nodded. "See what buying the drinks gets you," Raleigh said. Standing behind Raleigh and Tully, in the open doorway, was Abby. Her eyes were wide, and she had still had her napkin in her hand. Damn, I thought, why did this have to happen when I was with her? And on our first date? Guess there goes that relationship. I walked to Abby and started to apologize. "You sure know how to show a girl a good time, don't you?" Abby said with a big grin. "Come on, our supper is getting cold." She took my hand and led me back into the restaurant. A few minutes later, Frank, Raleigh, and Tully re-entered and went back to their table. Tully slowed as he went by our table and leaned over. "I think you've got a good one here, Matt. Don't screw it up." Abby heard him and softly said, "Thank you." I nodded at Tully and smiled at Abby. Damn if I don't think you're right, Tully, I thought. Dear listeners, please share your thoughts in the comments section below and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.